First, I would like to invite to the stage the first two moderators. Firstly, Katrin Kivimaa, who is my old friend and one of the mad Estonian feminists.
We like that.
I am really happy that she's here and tries to develop some discussion with Johanna Berzowska later. Katrin is also teaching at the Estonian Academy of Arts at the moment. For the second moderator, it's Sabine Seymour, who's part of the member of the Wearable IPC, and I've also known her for a very long time, so I'm also very glad to have her here as a moderator. And she has been working with wearable technology for quite many years now. So about 6 years. She was teaching at the Parsons Institute and also is the founder of the Moondial Corporation. And here is our first keynote speaker, Johanna Berzowska. She is from the Concordia University in Montreal, and she is also founder of the fashion. It doesn't matter. I'm really glad to have her here because of her East European background. She is from Poland originally, but living in Northern America for far too long. So I'm glad to have her here, and I really hope we'll see some of the sort of Polish wackiness here too.
So hello, good afternoon, welcome, and thank you very much to ISEA, to Tapio, to Mare, to everybody for inviting me here and for enabling this, which has so far been a fantastic event. In case you're wondering what this superhero logo is, this is actually my current company, which is called Extrasoft Labs, where I work with electronic textiles and various sorts of wearable technologies that are soft and squishy. The company that Mare was referring to is International Fashion Machines, which is where a lot of my original work, original research was started, and I'll show some of that today. I'm also going to give a really quick overview of the field of wearable technologies because it's actually an enormous and multifaceted and extremely I was going to say fragmented. I'm not sure if fragmented is the right word, but it's definitely a very wide and very big field. I'll show a little bit of work and mention a few research directions that I think are important and I think that are very well represented by all of the researchers and artists and designers who are present at this conference. And I'll ask a couple of questions that hopefully will generate some good discussion and comments with my co-speakers. So let's see. I just got a quick tutorial in Estonian from Mare. So tere tulemast, which means hello and welcome. So what is wearable technology? And I was first exposed to this whole field of wearable technology at the MIT Media Lab, where I did my graduate studies in the mid and late 90s. And back then, this is what I call the classic version of wearable technology, which basically refers to this idea of wearing a computer on your body. It's a very literal definition of wearable computing, wearable technology. And back then, I was actually working more in the field. I was a programmer. I was programming my own drawing tools, which were quite, maybe Polish, very romantic. I don't know about wacky. I guess they were wacky. I didn't realize Polish people are wacky. But that will explain a couple of things. And I started becoming interested in tangible computing. I started working with Hiroshi Ishii on this idea of tangible interfaces, different ways of working with my software. And in particular, I started becoming interested in this idea of using things worn on our bodies in order to interact with computational environments, in order to interact with my software, but other things in particular as well. And, you know, I first met these guys. They call themselves, most of them, this is Steve Mann, who refers to himself as the world's oldest cyborg. But a lot of these people, you know, have been wearing computers on their bodies on and off, probably since the early mid-90s. And I remember actually talking to Thad Starner at the time, who's this guy right here, who's now working at Georgia Tech, you know, and he, I told him I'm very interested in wearable computers. He said, great, come with me, I'll show you my wearable computer. And he basically picked up this really heavy black box that was angular with hard edges. It was in a metal case, and it was basically strapped to his body. So it was wearable, if you want to get really technical about what wearable means. But it wasn't wearable in the same sense that this is wearable. This is soft, it's comfortable, it's stretchy. I can lie down on it, I can take it off, throw it on the ground and jump on it and then put it on again, and it still works, it's still functional. The other sort of aspect of this classic or classical definition of wearable technology is actually a lot of the application domains, which I'll mention in a second. But a lot of the work that is done and well-funded deals with stuff such as, for example, the Remembrance Agent, which is a project developed in part by Brad Rhodes in collaboration with other people. What the Remembrance Agent does is you wear your little gear that has a camera. You also have, you know, usually some kind of head-mounted display that shows you your computer screen and some kind of input device. The most popular back in the day was called the Twiddler, just this kind of handheld keyboard that uses the idea of chords. So it's not one key per character, but different chords to enter different characters. So the Remembrance Agent was this project that if you met somebody new that perhaps you hadn't known before, maybe your camera, your head-mounted camera would take a photo of their face and do some basic algorithms for face recognition and tell you who that person is. If you don't have that running, you can just type in their name when they introduce themselves and look up info about them on the web. And also have a whole bunch of personal databases that would provide what's called contextual information that would tell you, oh yes, you know, this is Joey Berzowska. She in '92 posted this article in this news group that said this, you know, and these people would look at you and say, oh, hello, Joey, I see that in '92 you posted an article in a news group in which you stated this. Well, I'd like to, you know, maybe challenge that point of view. So it was this idea of helping to enable social interactions, but from a very kind of interesting perspective that's problematic and deals with these ideas of memory and information in ways that I will come back to later on in this talk. The other aspect of this kind of classic version of wearable technology is based on, well, is related to this idea of where does the money come from. When I started International Fashion Machines in Boston after with Maggie Orth, who was my collaborator, we tried a whole bunch of different business models to see what can actually be a viable money-making enterprise using wearable technology more from a fashion point of view. And interestingly, which was interesting, our main funding sources was actually defense research. And in the US, the military, in particular in the US, but I'm sure that in other countries as well, the military is extremely interested in wearable technology. In Massachusetts alone, there's two huge institutes. One is actually this new thing that got started at MIT about 2 years ago called the Institute for Soldier Nanotechnologies with a $50 million contract from the US Army. There's the Objective Force Warrior program, also in Massachusetts. And there's a whole bunch of research going on in how to make what I call smarter, you know, in that kind of tongue-in-cheek use of the word smart, smarter and stronger soldiers. The main research directions that are funded by this, a whole bunch of sensing technology, so both biometric sensing, sensing the body, because actually there's a lot of stuff that Central Command wants to know about their soldiers, how they're feeling, if they're sick, if they're not getting hypothermia, if they're wounded, how they might be wounded. Are they wounded enough to not send medical backup and so on, but also sensing, environmental sensing. So both, one of the projects that I actually worked on when I was at International Fashion Machines was this jacket that could sense bodies of water, i.e. humans, in the vicinity, and then through some kind of complicated other algorithms and database information, be able to determine if that mass of water was friend or foe. But also kind of environmental sensing that to detect, for example, some kind of biochemical weapon that might have been deployed in the environment, to detect the proximity of things and so on. Communication is a really big research direction in terms of defense research. So another project that we worked on was actually embroidered or woven antennas that can be incorporated into a garment, so you don't have to walk around with this enormous extensible metal antenna coming out of your backpack that can actually be integrated into your clothes. And of course, wireless communication to track, communicate, and so on. And also a whole bunch of research in textiles that can either facilitate diagnosis and treat the body, that can provide additional strength, like an exoskeleton. There's actually fantastic research going on into textiles that can, when your bone is broken, the textile hardens, so the textile is soft, just like my shirt, but when your bone breaks, the textile itself hardens to provide a temporary cast around your limb until you're able to get better medical support. And finally, one of the most sort of interesting from the fashion point of view areas of military research deals with interactive camouflage. So clothing that soldiers can wear, uniforms that adapt visually to the environment to help them be more stealthy. Another huge source of funding actually comes from biofeedback and wearable health monitoring. And this smart shirt, which is kind of an old project out of Georgia Tech, sort of trying to be commercialized by a company called Sensatex out of New York. Originally, this shirt was developed with, and it incorporates a whole bunch of sensors that track your body, your vital signs, all of your body data, as well as it has optical fiber optic woven into the fabric. Fiber optics can be used as a really kind of cheap bend sensor because you send light from one end to the other, and based on the curvature of the fiber, more or less light gets through. But also, if there is a discontinuity in the fiber, no light gets through at all. So this shirt was originally funded by a research project that basically dealt with trying to determine when a soldier was wounded and how and where, and whether to send a medical team or whether it was too late. So depending on where the discontinuity in the textile occurs, the shirt also communicates wirelessly with central command, I assume, and they can determine whether to send the medical teams or not. There's a whole bunch of wearable health monitoring that is actually deployed for the consumer market. So you can track, what you're eating, how much you're exercising, what your heart rate is, what your blood pressure is, and then adjust your lifestyle accordingly. Right? A lot of this stuff, and this actually comes back to this idea of where is the money coming from. A lot of this stuff has fairly extreme implications in terms of privacy and surveillance. There's a whole bunch of projects also that deal with the idea of a smart home that incorporate wearable technologies to kind of track and help people living in their home establish better patterns so they can be healthier, more productive, and so on. What's really interesting is that all of this work usually is framed around the idea of being useful for either children or the elderly, who are two kind of user groups, if I can call them that are traditionally not accorded the same sorts of rights as us people who are not children or elderly. And it's based on the assumption that children and elderly patients, don't have as much need of privacy and will be happy to surrender their privacy in order to feel more secure or have extend the period of time where perhaps they can live independently at home without having to go to some institution. There are a lot of privacy issues, a lot of kind of things that I hope will come up in the discussion later on. I see my two co-speakers writing feverishly. Consumer products, a lot of them that exist out there and that can be acquired, that can be purchased, where money is being made, are influenced by the funding structures that I just mentioned, by the kind of pharmaceutical / healthcare industry and military defense industry. But there's also a few other things. I mean, the stuff that actually is making money, there is this idea of futuristic aesthetic, you know, so there's science fiction, which makes a lot of money. And in fact, even in haute couture, there's many designers that are incorporating these ideas of digital technologies and electronics in the design of garments. This is from a Givenchy 99 collection. At the same time, there's been a whole bunch of these like wearable fashion shows, and this was from one of the early ones at the MIT Media Lab in '97, where most of the stuff was just concept prototypes. It wasn't really working, but these ideas of the wearable musical instrument where you would hit yourself in different places and make sounds. This idea of the kind of independent news reporter who could be deployed in war zones, and here you see one camera on one hand, another camera on the other hand, so she can be conducting an interview with different people at the same time and edit on the fly. And all of these things are very appealing and they're very seductive. You know, they're very linked to this idea of superpowers, of being able to extend your abilities, of being able to do things that you've always dreamt of doing and weren't able to earlier. Portable computing is definitely part, I think, of this large space. And I won't talk too much about that. There's high-performance sports clothing that's been around for a long time, so like heated boots. This is actually a great example of wearable computing. It's this inflatable, it's from Samsonite, and it's just an inflatable collar, so you can sleep all comfy on the plane. A lot of industrial applications related to universal connectivity and kind of specific applications for particular domains. And then also there's been quite a few high visibility hype products, such as the most recent one is actually the Burton and Apple collaboration for the Burton Amp jacket. But this is an older one, which was a collaboration between Levi's and Philips, that embed various sorts of portable computing devices in clothing, sometimes with a degree of electronic textile action in there as well. So instead of using wires, perhaps using some kind of conductive yarns and so on. A lot of new materials, such as Luminex and electronic ink, which I'll mention in a second. And all of that stuff is out there and it's kind of existing, but none of it is making a whole bunch of money. And people are often asking, you know, what is the killer application? What's the killer app? What's the thing that's actually going to make this whole industry take off? And I want to take a step back for a second and talk for a little bit about just object culture, material culture a little bit, from a kind of social, cultural point of view. One of the articles that I always give to all of my students before they start working with wearable technologies or ubiquitous computing is this article by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi that's called Why We Need Things. And this is a little dated already, but he outlines kind of three main, I'll go back. He outlines three main kind of directions or three main motivations that drive us in our in acquiring objects and surrounding ourselves with objects, because we certainly surround ourselves with many, many objects. He talks about objects as symbols of personal power, objects as symbols of the continuity of the self through time, so objects that reference the past, the present, or also the future, kind of the future that we dream of. And he also talks about objects as symbols of social relationships and the permanence of social relationships. So if we make the assumption that reactive clothing that can change and express different things visually is an important thing to look at, there needs to be a lot of research that happens in the field of non-emissive displays, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a second. Also, a related aspect I mean, a related direction to that is what I call soft computation. And this, you know, to get away from the wires, from the hard boxes, from the things that you can't step on, from the things that you can't go out in the rain when they're on your body. This idea of wearables as very intimate technologies, and I think another very interesting point of discussion is what does intimate mean? I in fact have Steve Mann, the guy whose photo I showed at the very beginning, who wears computers on his body pretty much all the time, and I have had a lot of kind of heated arguments where we use the exact same words, but they mean very different things, and especially words such as intimacy are very charged and very complicated. And I'll also talk a little bit more about memory and remembering things and wearable technologies as memory-rich artifacts. So textiles as a display or changeable reactive textiles have been kind of a fashion fantasy and a military fantasy for quite some time. And there's a lot of talk about this, but technically it's actually quite a long way away. And there's a lot of, most of the stuff that does exist uses emissive technologies. So emissive technologies like LEDs or electroluminescent stuff that shine, that emit light. And that's, you know, it's fun, but it's problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that you can't really see it during the day. Two, it's not considered stylish by people who are perhaps not like going to clubs all the time. But also, those things are still not comfy enough and not, well, just not comfortable enough because a lot of them rely on hard elements. So, in terms of reactive non-emissive textiles, and I'll actually just show this video while I talk. This is electronic ink, and I need to change. So this is what's called electronic ink, or e-ink, and there's a couple of companies that are developing competing technologies for electronic ink. The idea is, as you can see in this slide, that it's actually little molecules or little particles that encapsulate these pigment chips that have different charge. So I don't know how well you can see, but the black ones are negatively charged and the white ones are positively charged. And by addressing these electrodes under the ink, you can make them flip up and down, and so it looks black or white, but without emitting light. So this is, so you can sort of see it's small, it's flat, it's a little flexible, but not flexible enough. And the idea is that maybe in the next 10 or 15 years or 20 years, this ink will no longer need to be laminated like this, but you'll be able to print it on a textile as long as you can address it somehow, send power to it to make the little things flip up and down. When I was at IFM, we developed a whole series of these. We called them animated fashion modules, or AFM. And we were hoping to deploy them, you know, in handbags or wearables because they're not quite flexible enough to really have on the textile just yet, but you could have them in boots or belts or other accessories. And there's still a lot of technical problems because if you squeeze the ink, the electrons start jumping around, so the pigment chips lose their charge, and it's not quite there yet for wearable applications. I'm going to change back. I can't have two video streams at the same time. That's the problem. So the next thing we started working with, you know, after we realized that e-ink wasn't this magical thing just yet, is what's called electric plaid. And the way that that works is it uses resistive heating to heat these panels of thermochromic ink. And thermochromic ink, thermo means heat and chromic means color. So it's an ink that changes color with a change in temperature. And by weaving or embroidering or sewing conductive yarns into the textile and then sending power through that, you can actually, because the yarns are chosen specifically to be slightly resistive, some of the power gets converted into heat energy, and you can generate heat and make the color change. So this was one of the first pieces that we did, and it's just woven on a regular loom, and it's very rectilinear, so that's why it's called plaid. But what's really neat is like once you start sewing or using other looms, such as the jacquard loom, which is what I'm using right now, you can get away from this rectilinear square thing and start working more with circles. So this was a very simple prototype, which is just a circle of thermochromic ink with 3 lines sewn through it with this conductive yarn. And these are like 3 pixels, and you can make it change color, change shapes. And this is, again, does not emit light, but the pattern can change over time. And then working with weaving and working with a jacquard loom, I can actually have these 3-dimensional structures woven into the textile, so that in these shapes that you see here, the conductive yarn comes to the surface, and then in the rest of the textile, it goes to the back. And you can actually have these very rough, almost circuit boards that are woven just by manipulating all of the different threads and yarns through the weaving process and through the kinds of weaving structures that you choose. So then coating that with the thermochromic ink, you see this is my really geeky demo. I'm pointing to this brown, chocolate brown thing that's changing to yellow, and this yellow one is changing to brown. And there's a couple of close-ups so you can see how it works. So this stuff, this is, I think, very important research, as I said, both in terms of camouflage, military stuff, but also if we really want to have these garments that change color, whether they're changing color just because you're going from daytime to nighttime or from office to party, or whether they're actually changing color for various like useful reasons, like to show you that you're late for an appointment or tell you when you're supposed to get off the ferry before it leaves again. So that's kind of one direction. The second related one is this thing that's called soft computation. And what I basically mean by that is electronic textiles. Electronic textiles, I'm just going to read this, basically refers to a textile substrate that incorporates capabilities for sensing, whether it's biometric or external, communication, usually wireless, power transmission, and interconnection technology to allow sensors or things such as information processing devices to be networked together within a fabric. And it's basically textiles that allow little bits of computation to occur on the body, and they use different kinds of conductive yarns instead of wires. You can get yarns that have very different electromechanical properties, that are more or less conductive, that are spun or twisted, that use different kinds of metals, that corrode in different ways, that when you stretch them, maybe the resistance changes, that you can knit with, that you can sew with. There's actually a whole bunch of these threads and yarns available out there. Again, most of them originally developed for either aerospace industry or various kinds of military applications. But there's more and more research labs that work on textiles, that are developing their own kinds of conductive yarns right now. So the idea of soft computation is basically that we're looking at this old technology, which is textiles, and trying to develop a new kind of wearable technology that's based on all of the tradition, techniques, and methods of garment making or textile making. So I'll just show 2 quick examples. This is my student, Vincent Leclerc, who's fantastic, and he's now my collaborator. And these are a couple of projects that we worked on together. So this is, for example, it's called Blazer, and it's a sleeve that displays text. And what we're doing here, just from a technical point of view, is using things like snaps to act both as a display, but also as a switch. So there are little LEDs embedded in these snaps, and when you close the snap, it turns the switch on, but it also, the light itself, you don't need to be soldering. You can't solder to a textile, so you have to come up with all of these different ways of embedding these things that are hard. And thankfully, we already have some hard things in our garments, like buttons and zippers and so on. What this does, basically, is when you turn all of the LEDs on, they just start flashing in kind of what looks like a random pattern. But when you actually are wearing this sleeve and moving through the city, either on a bicycle or a motorcycle or running, it starts displaying text. This uses this idea of retinal persistence. I don't know if you've seen these clocks that are just like like an array of LEDs, and it moves really fast, and then you can see the time. So this sort of does the same thing. When you're wearing it and standing still, it's just flashing in what looks like noise, but when you're actually moving through the city, you're leaving this trail of text behind you. And so that's one aspect of what I call soft computation, is using the traditional methods and instruments of garment making in order to incorporate the digital technologies and the electronics into a textile. The other part is this idea of switching and using different kinds of conductive materials to create low-resolution circuit boards. So a switch is just something that basically makes a connection or breaks it. But on the body, what does that mean? How can you switch things? And it actually opens up this really rich choreographic language, because you can push or pull or stomp or grope or slap, roll or kiss, and all of these things can be switches. So what do I mean by that? This is another project that will kind of illustrate, and these are other sleeves that have a whole bunch of conductive strips sewn onto them. And again, technically, there's also this is the only part that's hard. So there's a little microcontroller here and some resistors, and then there's the battery. But other than the central part, everything else is actually sewn on or embroidered with various kinds of conductive yarns based on what we need. And so this is a whole bunch of switches, and when you wear the sleeves and you move your arms and you touch your arms to each other, or even move the sleeves on your arms, it just makes different noises. But it's this idea of augmenting your body movement and augmenting kind of your physical space with this other medium, which is sound. And this brings me to my most recent research interest, which deals with memory. And I actually want to make the connection to the thing that I mentioned at the very beginning, the remembrance agents, or the wearable computers that help you remember stuff. And there's actually, digital technologies, one of the things that they've allowed us to do is to store and hoard and hide and sit on ever-increasing amounts of information. I mean, there's photos, emails, text. We've become obsessed with kind of this harvesting of information. And on the research side as well, there's a lot of funding that goes to stuff like remembrance agents, personal digital assistants, things that will help you remember and catalog and organize all of that information that you're accumulating about yourself. And most of that research is actually it's predicated on the assumption that we want to remember everything. That we forget things, which is true, we forget things all the time, but also that we want to remember everything. And I don't think that's quite true, and I think that that's something that needs to be discussed and examined in quite a lot of detail. And I made this graph a while ago, and actually talking with Bill Seaman the other day, we came up with other axes that should be here too. But we can look at this very simple beginning of the memory space, and on one axis we actually have things that we remember and things we forget. But there's also another important axis, which are things that we want to remember and things that we want to forget. Other possible axes are, for example, things that we don't know we want to remember and things we don't know we want to forget, and we can keep going from there. But it's important to think about this. I mean, what does memory mean? And why do we want to remember things? And which things do we want to remember? At the same time, clothing is an extremely intimate thing. It's really one of the most intimate things that we interact with in our daily lives. It is on our skin, in all of the most intimate parts of our body. We have various items of clothing. And then, without even any kind of digital technologies, clothing, because of its extremely close relationship to our body, it actually does witness a lot of our most intimate moments. It records our smells, our fears, our excitements, and so on, through all the various kind of things that we secrete from our body. So all of these worn objects, all of these garments carry the evidence of our identity and our history, and then digital technologies allow us to edit that evidence, or to shape it, or to modify it in various ways. So there's also a couple of motivations for why I'm really interested in memory. One of them is, and physical memory in particular, this physical history of use. One of them is that much of the traditional research in wearable computing actually is kind of afraid of the body. It's stuff that you wear on your body, but it doesn't deal with the body in very explicit terms. And a lot of researchers still think of clothing as a sort of an exoskeleton. For example, Steve Mann talks a lot about his clothing as a building built for a single inhabitant.